Vlad III of Wallachia, known as Vlad the Impaler, spent his final day in December 1476 not in his fortress, but in a forest north of Bucharest, fighting yet another battle against the Ottoman Empire. He'd ruled through terror for years, impaling tens of thousands of people and displaying their bodies as psychological warfare. But on this day, probably around December 10th, his small army was ambushed by Ottoman forces. The details are murky because multiple chronicles give different accounts, but the consensus is this. Vlad became separated from his main force during the chaos. Some accounts say he climbed a hill to get a better view of the battlefield and was mistaken for a Turkish soldier by his own men, who killed him. Others claim Turkish assassins disguised as his own troops got close enough to strike. What we know for certain is that he was decapitated. His head was preserved in honey and sent to Constantinople, where Sultan Mehmed II displayed it on a stake as proof that the impaler was dead. The man who'd terrorized entire regions, who once invited boyars to a feast and impaled them all, who'd created forests of impaled Ottoman soldiers, died in confusion, possibly killed by his own forces. His head paraded through the streets of the empire he'd fought his entire life. Ivan IV of Russia, Ivan the Grozny, mistranslated as the Terrible, but better understood as the Fearsome, spent March 27, 1584, feeling unwell. He was 53, but decades of paranoia, violence, and possibly mercury poisoning from syphilis treatments had aged him terribly. That morning, he took a bath, which his attendants later noted seemed to refresh him. He spent several hours in his treasury, showing his gems to nobles, discussing the properties of precious stones. He claimed his turquoise had become dull, which he said indicated his approaching death. Around 3 p.m., he decided to play chess. He was set up at the board, but then he collapsed. Some accounts say he fainted while setting up the pieces, others that he had a stroke mid-game. Physicians rushed in, but within minutes he was dead. The man who'd ordered the Operchina terror, who'd killed his own son in a rage 3 years earlier, who'd blinded the architect of St. Basil's Cathedral so he could never build anything more beautiful, died playing a board game. There were immediate rumors he'd been poisoned. Modern analysis of his remains shows extremely high levels of mercury, but whether that was from treatment or assassination remains debated. His death came suddenly, without the dramatic end you'd expect for someone who'd spent decades making others suffer elaborately. Genghis Khan's death in August 1227 is shrouded in deliberate mystery, because his followers went to extraordinary lengths to hide it. His final day came during a military campaign against the Western Shah dynasty. The exact cause of death is disputed. Some chronicles say he fell from his horse during a hunt days earlier and the internal injuries finally killed him. Others claim he died from illness, possibly typhus or plague, and one particularly colorful account says he was castrated by a captured Shah princess who'd hidden a blade. What we know about his final hours is limited but specific. He was in his tent, likely in what is now northwest China. He called his sons and generals to him and gave final orders. The Shah dynasty must be completely annihilated as punishment. No mercy, every city razed. He designated Ogedei as his successor. Then he died, probably in the early morning hours. What happened next shows how feared he was even in death. His funeral escort killed anyone they encountered on the journey back to Mongolia to keep the location secret. Hundreds, possibly thousands of people were killed simply for being on the road. His burial site was trampled by horses until no trace remained. The man who'd conquered more territory than anyone in history, who'd killed an estimated 40 million people, whose armies were so feared that cities surrendered at the mere rumor of their approach, disappeared into an unmarked grave that remains undiscovered nearly 800 years later. Attila the Hun spent his final day in 453 AD celebrating his latest marriage. He'd just married a young Gothic woman named Ildiko, and the wedding feast went late into the night. Multiple accounts describe him drinking heavily, eating excessively, in high spirits. He retired to his bedchamber with his new bride. The next morning, when he didn't emerge, servants grew concerned. They eventually broke down the door and found him dead in bed, lying in a pool of blood that had poured from his nose. Ildiko sat in the corner, terrified, unharmed. What killed the man Rome called the Scourge of God? The most likely explanation is a massive nosebleed caused by alcohol-induced esophageal varices. He essentially drowned in his own blood while too drunk to wake up. No battle, no assassination, no dramatic last stand against the Roman Empire he'd terrorized for years. Just choking on blood in bed on his wedding night. His warriors, devastated, held a massive funeral. They cut their faces and hair in mourning, buried him in 3 nested coffins of gold, silver, and iron, then killed all the slaves who dug the grave to keep the location in secret. The man who'd extracted tribute from Rome, who'd razed cities across Europe, who'd made emperors tremble, died ignobly. Perhaps the universe's way of balancing accounts. Caligula spent January 24th, 41 AD at the Palatine Games in Rome, theatrical performances he was hosting. By this point in his reign, he'd become completely unhinged, declaring himself a living god, engaging in incest with his sisters, killing senators on whims, and planning to make his horse a consul. That morning, he'd sacrificed a flamingo as part of the ceremonies. Blood splattered on his toga, which several witnesses later claimed was an omen. Around noon, he left the theater through a cryptoporticus, an underground passageway. Members of his Praetorian Guard were waiting: Cassius Chaerea, whom Caligula had repeatedly mocked for effeminacy, and several conspirators. They attacked him in the narrow passage. The first blow struck him in the jaw. Caligula tried to run, screaming for his Germanic bodyguards, but the tunnel was too cramped. They stabbed him repeatedly, over 30 wounds. His uncle Claudius, who'd been with him at the games, fled and hid behind a curtain. The assassins then went to the palace and murdered Caligula's wife Caesonia and their infant daughter, smashing the baby's head against a wall. The emperor, who'd claimed to be Jupiter incarnate, who'd ordered soldiers to collect seashells as spoils from Neptune during a fake ocean invasion, who'd executed people during dinner parties for entertainment, died begging for his life in a tunnel. He was 28 years old. His reign lasted less than 4 years, but his cruelty became legendary. Louis XVI spent January 20th, 1793, his final full day, in the Temple prison in Paris. He knew execution was coming. He'd been sentenced to death by the National Convention 3 days earlier. He spent the morning with his family, his wife Marie Antoinette, his sister Madame Elizabeth, his daughter Marie Therese, and his son Louis Charles. They didn't tell the children this was goodbye, only that he'd see them the next morning. He ate dinner with them around 7 p.m. Afterward, around 9 p.m., he said his final farewell. The scene was devastating. His family clung to him, sobbing. He promised to see them at 7 a.m. the next day, though he knew he wouldn't. His last night was spent with his confessor, Abbe Edgeworth. He tried to sleep around midnight, but couldn't. At 5 a.m. on January 21st, he woke, dressed in simple clothes, heard mass in his room. Around 8 a.m., he was taken in a carriage through silent Paris streets to the Place de la Révolution. The journey took 2 hours because they went a deliberately long route. Throughout, he read psalms from a prayer book. When he arrived at the scaffold around 10:20 a.m., he climbed the steps quickly, tried to address the crowd, saying, "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have caused my death." But the drums drowned him out on Santaire's orders. The executioner and his assistants strapped him to the plank. At 10:22 a.m., the blade fell. The executioner held up his severed head. Some in the crowd cheered. Others rushed forward to dip handkerchiefs in his blood. The king, who'd inherited absolute power but lacked the ruthlessness to maintain it, died with dignity he'd rarely shown while ruling. Czar Nicholas II spent July 16, 1918 under house arrest in Yekaterinburg with his entire family. They'd been imprisoned for over a year since his abdication. That day seemed like any other in captivity. The family woke late, around 10 a.m. Nicholas read, played games with his son Alexei, who was ill and bedridden with hemophilia. His wife Alexandra wrote in her diary about the weather. They had no idea this was their final day. Around 7 p.m., they had dinner together as usual. The evening was warm. Around 10:30 p.m., they prepared for bed. Just after midnight, around 2 a.m. on July 17th, the commandant, Yakov Yurovsky, woke them, saying they needed to move to the basement for their safety because anti-Bolshevik forces were approaching and there might be gunfire. The family dressed and gathered. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, their doctor, a servant, and the cook. They were led to a semi-basement room. Chairs were brought for Alexandra and Alexei. The others stood. Yurovsky returned with armed men. He announced, "Your relations have tried to save you. They have failed. We must now shoot you." Nicholas stood, said, "What?" Yurovsky shot him in the chest. Then the others opened fire. The room filled with smoke and screaming. The daughters had sewn jewels into their clothing, which acted as armor, causing bullets to ricochet. It took 20 minutes of shooting, bayoneting, and clubbing to kill everyone. The bodies were stripped, burned with acid, and dumped in a mineshaft. The most powerful autocrat in the world, who'd ruled 150 million people, who'd sent millions to die in World World War I, spent his final moments watching his children murdered in a basement, unable to protect them. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, spent his final day in September 210 BC traveling, obsessed with immortality. He'd been touring eastern China in his 5th imperial tour, partly to inspect his empire, partly searching for the elixir of life. He'd become increasingly paranoid about death, consuming mercury pills his alchemists promised would make him immortal. These pills were actually killing him slowly. On this day, he was traveling through Hebei province when he fell seriously ill. The mercury poisoning had finally reached critical levels. He knew something was wrong. He dictated a letter to his eldest son Fusu, ordering him to return to the capital for his funeral, essentially naming him successor. But he died before the letter was sent. His chief eunuch Zhao Gao and Prime Minister Li Si decided to hide his death. They continued the journey with his corpse in the carriage, placing rotting fish in carts around it to hide the smell of decomposition. They forged a new letter ordering Fusu to commit suicide and installed the more controllable younger son, Hu Hai, as emperor. For 2 months, they kept up the charade, delivering meals to his carriage, announcing imperial edicts, until they finally reached the capital and announced his death. The man who'd unified China, built the Great Wall, buried scholars alive, burned books, created the terracotta army to serve him in death, died seeking immortality through poison, then rode as a rotting corpse for months while his subordinates plotted. Timur, known as Tamerlane, died in February 1405 while planning his greatest campaign yet, the invasion of Ming China. He'd spent decades conquering territory from Delhi to Moscow, building pyramids from the skulls of his enemies, killing an estimated 17 million people. But at 68, during the harsh winter, camped near Otrar in modern Kazakhstan, he fell ill. Some sources say pneumonia, others a fever. His final days were spent in his tent, issuing orders, refusing to accept he was dying. He called for wine despite his doctor's objections, drank heavily, which worsened his condition. On February 17th or 18th, he finally died. His followers were devastated. They built an empire on his military genius, and they knew it would fragment without him, which it did. His body was embalmed with musk and rose water, placed in an ebony coffin, and transported to Samarkand. There's a legend that his tomb carried a curse: "When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble." In June 1941, Soviet anthropologist Mikhail Gerasimov opened the tomb to study Timur's remains. The local imam warned him of the curse. 2 days later, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Timur's body was reburied with full Islamic rites in November 1942, just before the Soviet victory at Stalingrad. Coincidence or not, the man who'd made the world tremble in life apparently wasn't done.